The trunk was too fine for this country. Polished walnut, brass corners dulled by miles of rail dust, a silk ribbon still knotted, as if the East refused to let go. It sat on the platform of last West Town, while the morning light came thin through a veil of blown grit, and every eye that passed it gave a quick measure. Weight, worth, story. The boy with the messenger cap circled once, twice, like a coyote testing wind. He read the tag the way poor boys read prayers. Clara Bellamy, Blue Mesa Ranch. The name didn't belong to the station, or to the cracked clay that ran out from it in seams and fissures all the way to Saddle Butte. It didn't belong to the horses stamped in old iron, or to the spent tobacco stains under booth heels, or to the leaning telegraph pole singing a single high-wire note. It carried another kind of weather, a parlor, a clock that chimed the quarter hour, a mother's hands pressing creases flat. Elias Crow watched the trunk like he watched the horizon. He stood with his weight on his good leg and his hat pulled low, as if he could keep the sky from seeing the fresh hitch in his stride. The bandage under his trouser leg burned with its own slow fire. He had not asked the doctor for laudanum. Pain helped a man mind his edges. Pain kept him honest. Billy Rios climbed the step and tugged at Elias's coat. "Train's due, Mr. Crow. 10 minutes. You want I should keep the trunk by the door? Leave it be," Elias said. His voice came quiet, the kind you heard only if it was meant for you. "It belongs where it was set." Wind pushed a curtain of grit down Main Street, scouring the paint off the hotel sign and biting the skin where a man forgot his scarf. Across the way, Ruth Abernathy was knocking pots against a rail to send last night's ashes into the morning. Somewhere, a horse stamped and rang its bit. The desert did its patient work of erasing. Amos would have hated this part. The waiting. Elias let the name form behind his teeth, bitter and clean. Sheriff Amos Lyle, tall, deliberate, a man who signed his name one careful swoop at a time, who'd say, "A thing is right because it's right, Eli, not because it's easy." 3 days in fever and a fourth in silence, and then the body carried under a sky as big as judgment. Elias had stood at the head of the box. He had touched the wood. He had promised, "Keep the ranch running, keep the water lawful, receive the bride if she comes." The wire had gone through after the fact. Trains keep their schedules. Brides keep their tickets. Death keeps its own. "If she steps down alone," Elias said, not looking at Billy, "you call me Mr. Crow like you always do. If she looks scared, you use ma'am twice in the first sentence. And if anyone laughs, you remember who owes your ma for the winter coal." Billy nodded, solemn as a deacon. "Yes, sir." The whistle came thin at first, then tore the air open like a stitch. The engine showed itself a black lung breathing steam, a sun-bright fan of metal at its nose, the cars rattling like a bad memory, strung to another bad memory all the way back to Pennsylvania. Elias put 2 fingers to the brim of his hat. He did not move. Steel kissed steel. The train sighed into stillness. Doors opened. A salesman with city shoes ran a hand over his mustache and stepped carefully to keep the dust off his cuffs. 2 women in traveling black kept their veils down and their eyes straighter. A man in a frock coat coughed into a handkerchief, stained red at the corner the West would have him, or it wouldn't. She came last, as if to let the country look at her one bite at a time. A plain traveling dress, blue worn to a tired sky, gloves the color of old cream, a hat that had known better days. She held her back straight, though the kind of straightness that happens when you're thinking about it, not the kind that's bred into you. Her mouth was a careful line. Her eyes were busy. Billy stepped quick. "Miss Bellamy, ma'am? Miss Clara Bellamy?" She turned, and the look she gave him said 2 things at once. "I am alone, and I will not be small about it." "Yes," she said, and the word carried the last of the East in it like a note that refuses to die. "I am Clara Bellamy." "Oh." Billy touched his cap. "Welcome to last Westtown, ma'am. I'm to fetch you for Blue Mesa." He gestured without pointing. A boy's politeness learned hard. "This here is Mr. Crow." Elias set his hat back a fraction. "Ma'am, Mr. Crow." She looked at his limp, then at his eyes, then at the space beside him where a second man might have stood. She did not ask the question, which meant she already knew the answer, or else she had come all this way to let the truth speak for itself once it had dirt in its mouth. He didn't reach for her hand. Men sometimes shook hands with women at stations. It made towns feel civilized. This was not that sort of day. He nodded to the trunk. Yours? Yes. Good. It can ride easy. He picked up the trunk without showing that he was measuring pain off against pride, the way a man might count coin into a palm. Billy scurried to take his end, and together they carried it across the boards, down the step, into the bite of the morning. The street watched them. A trunk. A woman. A man with a promise hanging on him like a second coat. They set the trunk in the wagon, braced with a folded tarp. Elias tied it with the same knot he used when the river ran too fast and the world tried to pull cattle off their feet. He did not look at her again until the knot held. "You'll want water," he said. "Town's water isn't clean. The canteen is." She hesitated, then took it. The first swallow went slow. The second went like the body had taken charge. "Thank you. You're welcome." They rode. The first mile was town false fronts standing bravely against wind, the sign for Ruth's place swinging on two stubborn chains, the church with its door latched back so the smell of old cedar could get out and the smell of heat could get in. Reverend Cole lifted a hand from the parsonage gate. Elias answered with 2 fingers and a chin. It was the only service the day required. A minute into open country, the land changed the terms. Mesquite. A scatter of rock, the long fall toward dry Angel Wash, where the white bones of cottonwoods waited for spring, and a bird threw its one sad call into miles of nothing to hear it. Sun reached for them with thin, thoughtful fingers, picked at their collars, found the sweat that had no business there this early. Clara kept her gloved hands folded in her lap, then unfolded them, then folded them again. She watched the horizon, then watched his hands on the reins, then watched the horizon again, as if to remind herself that the horizon was the point of this enterprise. At 200 words, the road hit a washboard stretch, and the wagon groaned, a sound like an old man getting out of a church pew. If you enjoy the story, hit that subscribe button right away, and if you don't, then just hit the like button anyway to keep more Wild West love stories coming. They reached the split where the trail went on toward the mines, and the Blue Mesa Road veered left, taking the long, patient line under Saddle Butte. Elias clicked to the team and felt the pull as the wagon leaned into the slight climb. He did not offer talk, but talk came anyway because silence in an empty country can feel like a dare. "Sheriff Lyle," she said, and then stopped, as if the name itself were a ridge to be crested. Elias kept his eyes on the ears of the led horse. "Yes, ma'am. I had 3 letters from him. The last was kind. It spoke of apple trees." Elias pictured the trees behind the ranch house, thin, earnest things, trying to be orchards in a place that asked too much of water. They put out blossoms some years. And other years? They try. She turned the canteen in her hands, brass on brass. The wire, it said. Her breath caught on the word regret without bringing it out. "I suppose you were there." "I was," Elias said. "Was it?" "Fast at the end," he said. "I'll say that much because it's the part a person needs to know." She closed her eyes once, a single nod to what couldn't be carried, and so had to be put down inside. When she opened them, they were clear of shine. Not dry, you don't dry something like that in a minute, but steady. The letter also spoke of a will. "It did," Elias said, "and that complicates things." "It simplifies them," Elias said. "Blue Mesa is yours by Amos's hand and the law's stamp. Complication comes later. We'll meet it standing up." He felt her look at him, a measure taken, a weight tested. The road went narrow for a breath between 2 shoulders of stone. Sun narrowed with it, a white blade. When it opened again, they rode out into country that had been red once and had faded to the color of old scars. "You knew him well," she said. "As well as men can know each other working the same ground," Elias said. "He had the harder work. He had to tell people no without losing them." "Is that what a sheriff is?" she asked. "In this place," Elias said, "it's what a man has to be when the plains invite fools and the fools bring guns." She glanced at his leg, then away. "I am sorry for your loss." "Thank you," he said. The words fell simple and right. "I am sorry for yours." They let the quiet have a mile. "You should know," she said at last. "I did not come west for romance. I came because the house at Walnut Street had too many doors a collector could knock on. I came because a promise was made to me in good letters. I came because I am 24 and people were beginning to use the word spinster in rooms they thought I had left. Elias didn't smile, though something in him moved a fraction toward warm. The West doesn't ask your reasons. It only asks what you'll do once you get here. And what would you have me do, Mr. Crow? Eat Ruth Abernathy's supper, for one, he said. Sleep. Put your hand on the Blue Mesa fence in the morning and decide whether the wood feels like a future. After that, we'll open Amos's desk and see what he left you besides trouble. She let out a sound that wanted to be a laugh and didn't quite trust itself. Is there a great deal of trouble? There's always trouble, Elias said. The question is whether it's yours or only passing through. Oh. They topped the last rise and there it was, sure as a thing can be in a world that has learned how to take. The house Amos built, white paint holding on, porch wrapped around it like an arm, the long barn with its doors pulled back for air, a windmill turning slow, patient as a prayer wheel, a few young apple trees put inside a fence to keep the jackrabbits honest. Beyond that, the corrals and the long smear of cattle like dark pebbles poured from a child's fist. Clara's hands gripped the seat. Not fear. Not exactly. The body making room for what the eye was asking it to hold. It's more than I expected, she said. That's the country's one kindness, Elias said. Sometimes it gives you a little more than you thought you'd be allowed. He hauled the wagon to where the porch shade reached, then set the brake. Billy was off the seat and running before the wheels had finished their last quarter turn. He took the steps 2 at a time and threw the door open, then remembered who he was supposed to be and stepped back like a butler in a big house whose wages were spotty. Inside, the air held a little of last night's cool stone fireplace. Plank floor worn to a soft shine by years of boots, shelves with books Amos had bought from a traveling man and promised himself he'd read when the work slowed, which meant he had read them on 3 evenings in 4 years. On the desk lay the ledger with a piece of pencil stuck into the ruled line where a man had been about to write "Hey, paid," and then had not. Elias set the trunk down in the front room. A man doesn't carry a lady's trunk to her room unless she asks it, not on a first day with a ghost still living in the corners. Mrs. Ruth will bring by stew, he said. There's coffee on the stove you're likely to hate. I have hated worse things, she said. He nodded. Your room's at the top of the stairs on the left. Amos had it aired. He meant to do right by you. She touched the banister as if to test whether the house would take the weight of a new life. The wood took it. Wood usually does. Mr. Crow, she said, not moving. What killed him? I mean, what really killed him? Greed with a law book in its pocket, Elias said after a breath. She blinked. A man? A habit, he said, but there's a man carrying it. Name's Jonah Pike. We'll speak of him when we have to. I prefer to know the names of my enemies early, she said softly. Then consider him introduced, Elias said. A shadow went across the porch cloud or memory. Outside, the windmill squealed once, asking for a drop of oil. A fly traced the edge of the ledger, decided against numbers, and went off to try its luck on the window. Clara put one hand on the trunk as if to claim it here and now in this room under this roof. The glove made a small sigh against the wood. She drew a breath that reached the bottom of her lungs and found ground there. All right, she said, I will stay the winter. Elias felt the words find their way into the house and sit down. A decision is a kind of furniture. It changes how a room feels. It changes how a man stands. Good, he said. The land talks in winter. If you listen, it'll tell you whether it wants you. And if it doesn't, it's honest about that too. Oh. Her mouth made the smallest shape of a smile. And you, Mr. Crow? Do you intend to be honest? It's the only language I've got left, he said. The afternoon laid its hand on the porch. The house took the weight. Somewhere behind the barn, a heifer bawled for a calf that had outgrown the bawling. The world kept up its work. Elias tipped his hat, stepped back over the threshold, and let the door fall to. He stood on the porch a minute longer than a man needs to stand and studied the angle of light. The angle didn't change. Then he turned toward the yard to see which fence was giving up first, and whether the mill would need its oil before sundown, and whether he could spare Billy to ride to Ruth's, or whether Ruth, knowing her own mind and everyone else's, would be halfway up the road already, with a pot that could feed 3 honest workers, or 1 grieving heart, pretending not to be hungry. He moved careful over the step, the leg waking its ache. He did not begrudge it. Pain is what remains when a promise outlives the man who asked it of you. Behind him, in the quiet of the front room, a woman from Walnut Street set down her hat and her gloves, unknotted a silk ribbon with fingers that shook only a little, and measured out the space where her life would have to fit. The house made a low settling sound, like a big animal shifting its weight to make room. And the desert, patient as time, waited to see whether these 2 stubborn souls would choose to bend, or to break, or to hold. The first frost came early that year, and with it a silence that hung over Blue Mesa like a held breath. The mornings were brittle enough that even sound seemed to crack when it tried to move. Frost feathered the windows, turned every fence line into a string of glass, and made the creek smoke as though the earth itself were exhaling. Elias Crow had seen 30 winters on the frontier, each one with its own brand of cruelty, some loud with blizzards, some quiet with hunger, but this one felt different. This one had teeth, the kind that bit down slow. He woke before the sun, the way a man does when habit has long since outlasted purpose. The cabin walls sighed as he stirred the embers in the stove. Sparks flared, brief as thoughts. He added a log, then another, until the orange light filled the single-room house with the smell of pine pitch and ash. Outside, the wind dragged itself across the flats, slow and cold as an old wolf. He checked the line shack logs, counted the feed sacks, and wrote the numbers in Amos's old ledger, the same one that had survived 3 owners, 2 floods, and the kind of bookkeeping that could break a saint's patience. Half those pages now bore Clara Bellamy's handwriting, tidy, slanted, precise like clock gears. A woman's order pressed into a man's world of dust. She took to ranch work the way dry ground takes to rain. She didn't shy from mud or rope burns. She learned the weight of tools by feel, the way a person learns the shape of truth with calluses. In the evenings she studied the ledgers, whispering the sums under her breath, fingers smudged with pencil lead. Elias had never thought a sound like numbers could be gentle, but when she read them, they were. And yet, every morning before joining him at the corral, she asked, "Mr. Crow, may I?" As if courtesy might stand between her and the hard wind that would burn her cheeks raw. He would nod, because some things a man doesn't grant he witnesses. By December, the herds had been driven in closer to the creek, and the hills stood bare except for brush and patches of pale snow. The cows bawled through nights that froze the troughs to glass. The woodpile shrank, and the rhythm of the axe became the heartbeat of the ranch. When the blade struck, the sound carried for miles, lonely as a church bell. Sometimes, near dusk, Clara stood by the porch staring toward the cottonwoods where the windmill turned. Elias knew that look. It was the gaze of someone measuring the distance between what was lost and what was still possible. He had worn that look himself once, before he learned how to live without asking for much. One evening she spoke without turning. "You don't say much, Mr. Crow." "I say what needs saying," he replied. "And how do you know what that is? When silence answers, you let it." Her laugh came soft, carried off by the wind before it reached the barn. "Then the West must be full of wise men." "No," he said. "Just men too tired to argue." The days stretched thinner. The mail coach stopped running regular. The telegraph went dead more often than not. The nearest town last west began to feel like rumor, a name whispered through snow. The world was shrinking down to wood smoke, hoofbeats, and 2 voices learning how to share the same silence. When the storm came, it didn't come politely. It rolled down from the northern buttes, a white wall with a howl in its gut. The first flakes were fat and lazy, and Elias, fool that he was, said it'd pass by morning. By nightfall the house shook. He and Clara fought the wind to pull the last of the calves into the side barn. Her shawl caught on a nail and tore clean down the middle, a sound sharp enough to make the wind pause. Elias stripped off his coat, heavy with frost, and threw it over her shoulders without a word. She didn't argue. There are moments when decency outranks pride. When they finally staggered back inside, she leaned against the door, breath coming in thin gasps, hair wet against her temples. Her lips had gone pale. Elias stirred the fire to life, coaxing it from ember to blaze until it licked up like something starved. "You ever seen one like this back east?" he asked. "No," she said, teeth chattering. "Back east, the snow is gentler. It asks permission. This kind takes what it wants." "This." He poured her a cup of coffee, black as the inside of the night. She took it, hands trembling. The steam blurred her face, the firelight painting her features in amber and shadow. It had been years since Elias had looked at another person that long without looking away. When the wind slammed against the walls hard enough to make the rafters moan, she flinched. "Will the roof hold?" "It's held worse." "And you?" He met her eyes. Still holding. Hours passed. The storm buried fences, trails, and thoughts. The house became an island of sound and breathing. At some point she fell asleep in the chair by the fire, the cup empty beside her, her head tilted toward the light. Elias sat opposite, watching the logs collapse into coals, his bad leg throbbing like an old confession. He thought of Amos, of promises, of how the world never ran short of ways to test a man's word. And somewhere between the creak of timber and the sigh of the wind, he realized that Clara Bellamy had stopped being a duty. She had become something else, something that made silence heavier. By morning the storm had trapped them completely. The door opened only halfway before snow spilled in like flour from a split sack. They dug out enough to reach the barn. The cattle were restless but alive. "Looks like we'll be staying close a while," he said. Clara's smile was tired but brave. "Then we'll make do." They did for 6 long days. On the first, he showed her how to mend a saddle seam. On the second, how to read the wind by smoke. By the third, they had fallen into a rhythm. She kept the stove fed. He braved the drifts to haul water. She read aloud in the evenings from a tattered novel she'd brought from Philadelphia. Her voice softened the edges of the room, turned the storm outside into something almost bearable. When she laughed, it loosened something in Elias that had rusted years ago. He began to tell small stories, how Amos had traded a single mule for 2 broken wagons and called it profit. How once, during the war, Elias had survived 3 days lost in fog, convinced the world had ended. He told them without intention, just to fill the space between her voice and the winds. One night, the stove burned low, and the house sank into that kind of quiet that tests the soul. She looked at him across the table, her hands curled around a mug of cooling coffee. "Tell me something true, Mr. Crow." He rubbed the scar on his knee. "Truth's a dangerous animal in a small room." "Then we'll keep the door open," she said. He met her gaze, saw no judgment there, only a kind of waiting. "I killed a man once who didn't deserve it," he said. "Thought he was stealing water. He wasn't. That's the truth that don't let me sleep." "Oh." The silence that followed wasn't heavy, it was human. She reached across the table, her hand hovering just above his. "Then maybe this land brought you here to make something right again." Outside, the wind had gone still, as if even the night was listening. When dawn came, the world was blinding. Snow lay clean over everything, smoothing the scars of fences and hoofprints. She stepped onto the porch, wrapped in his old coat, her breath rising like prayer. "You've given me more than shelter," she said quietly. Elias adjusted his hat, pretending to study the horses. "Just doing what's needed. Sometimes what's needed is kindness." He didn't answer. But when they passed through the doorway, his rough hand brushed hers, a small, accidental thing that neither of them pretended hadn't happened. That touch was worth every word they didn't say. The storm's passing didn't bring peace so much as pause. The snow glittered cruelly under sunlight, and every sound seemed magnified: the creak of the gate, the clop of hooves somewhere far off, the crack of melting ice. For the first time since the storm, Elias saddled his horse and rode the perimeter. Clara watched him go from the porch, the coat still around her shoulders, a slash of blue sky behind her. The sight struck him like a photograph he'd never own. At the northern fence he stopped, looked back at the house, a small dark square against a sea of white, and felt something he hadn't felt since the war ended, a reason to return. That night, they sat by the fire again. She was stitching the torn shawl with neat, steady hands. "Was it Amos who taught you ranching?" she asked. "Amos taught me how not to starve," Elias said. "The rest I learned from mistakes." "And before that?" "Before?" He smiled without humor. Before that, I was a man paid to break things. She looked up. The war? Yeah. It's where I learned that most orders are written by men who'll never hear the shots. She threaded her needle through cloth. And yet you still follow orders of weather, of cattle, of seasons. Those don't lie, he said. For a while they worked in companionable quiet. Then she said, when I left Philadelphia, my mother told me the West would turn me hard. Elias raised an eyebrow. Has it? Maybe. Or maybe it just scraped off what wasn't needed. He nodded slowly. The land does that. Same way wind carves rock, it takes time, but it changes everything. By the 5th day, the drifts began to sag under their own weight. They cleared the path to the creek and broke ice for the cattle. The world smelled of thaw, wet earth, and sap. Spring felt 1,000 years away, but it was hiding somewhere under all that white. Clara's cheeks had color again. She moved easily in the snow now, her steps confident. Watching her, Elias thought of how new things survive in old places. Maybe that's what the West was, a graveyard for one kind of life and the cradle for another. That evening, while she chopped vegetables for stew, she said, "Do you ever think of leaving?" He looked up from sharpening his knife. "Where would I go?" "Anywhere," she said. "East, maybe." He shook his head. "The East's full of ghosts that never learned to keep quiet." "Yes." She smiled faintly. "Then we're both exiles." "Guess that makes us neighbors," he said. When darkness came, she lit the lamp and read aloud again, this time from a different book, letters from soldiers, collected by some journalist. Her voice carried the ache of words written by men who knew they'd never go home. Elias listened, hearing pieces of himself in every line. After a while, she lowered the pages. "Does it ever stop the remembering?" "No," he said, "but it softens. Like scar tissue." She nodded. "Then maybe we both have some healing left to do." "Maybe," he said, and for the first time he let himself believe it. On the 7th morning the wind shifted, warm from the south. The snow began to melt in earnest. Elias hitched the wagon to check the lower pastures. Clara insisted on riding along. He didn't argue. They moved slow through the slush, the world glittering like a thawing dream. Halfway to the ridge, they found a calf stuck in a drift. Clara jumped down without waiting for instruction, waded knee-deep, and freed it with her bare hands. Elias watched, pride mixing with worry. "You're going to lose those fingers," he said. She blew on them, laughing. "Then I'll learn to write left-handed." When they finally turned back toward the house, the sky had gone orange with sunset. The mountains stood black against it, jagged as torn paper. Clara leaned against him on the wagon bench, exhausted. The smell of her hair, wood smoke, and soap filled the small space between them. He didn't move away. That night, after supper, she said quietly, "Mr. Crow, you can stop calling me Miss Bellamy if you like. Out here, formality feels like frostbite." He smiled. "Then what should I call you?" "Clara," she said. Just Clara. The name felt strange in his mouth, too soft for the man he was, but he said it anyway. "Clara." She looked up, surprised at the gentleness in his tone. "Yes." "Elias?" "Nothing," he said. "Just making sure it fits." The days that followed blurred. Snow melted, froze, and melted again. The ranch returned to its ordinary labor, mending, feeding, waiting. But something in that routine had shifted. There was laughter now between them, small and uncertain, but real. One afternoon, she found an old phonograph Amos had traded for years back. The horn was dented, the crank stiff. She cleaned it, coaxed it to life, and for the first time since Elias could remember, music filled the cabin. A slow waltz, scratchy and distant. She swayed to it, half mocking, half dreaming. "Dance with me," she said. He shook his head. "Been too long. Then we'll start slow." She stepped close, guiding his hands, one on her waist, the other awkwardly suspended. The floor creaked beneath their boots. They moved clumsily, laughing. Outside, the snow was melting, and water ran off the roof like applause. When the record ended, neither spoke. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of everything they hadn't yet dared to name. That evening he fixed the lantern wick and found himself humming the tune under his breath. Clara looked up from her book and smiled. "So you do know the steps," she teased. "Some dances never leave you," he said. Later, when the wind turned soft and the moon burned over the ridge, Elias Crow stood on the porch. The air smelled clean, full of thaw and promise. Inside, Clara's lamp still glowed through the curtain, her shadow moving about the room. He thought of all he'd lost, the friends, the years, the parts of himself buried in places without markers. And then he thought of the woman inside that cabin, mending the tear in her shawl with careful hands, humming faintly to a melody the frontier would soon forget. He realized that the hardest thing about surviving the frontier wasn't the cold or the loneliness. It was learning that, even after everything you've lost, the heart can still thaw. Still here? Hit the comments with a flood of 1 second and tell us where you're watching from if you love stories of the last West town. By late February, the wash had run dry. Not dry the way winters make it when snowmelt waits its turn, patient in the mountains, but dry like it had been stolen. The kind of dry that doesn't just thirst, it accuses. Elias Crow stood in the bed of the creek, boots sinking into cracked mud that flaked like old paint. The air shimmered faintly, though the sun wasn't high yet. He felt its weight between his shoulder blades, merciless as memory. A long winter of quiet labor had led him here, to this betrayal that smelled of dust and iron. 2 miles north, the stream should have been running clear, cold water rolling off the thawing slopes to feed the troughs, to fill the hearts of men and cattle alike. But there was no sound now, only the hush of wind through brittle weeds and the faint creak of his saddle leather as he knelt. He scooped a handful of clay and crushed it in his palm. It powdered instantly. Nothing. No moisture. No promise. Someone had taken what belonged to the land, and Elias already knew who. Jonah Pike. The name tasted like rust. Pike's men had been dragging timber up Dry Angel Wash for weeks. They called it a settling pond, the way a thief might call himself an investor. Every man in town knew what that meant. A dam by another name. A theft done with nails instead of guns. Elias rose slowly, dusting his gloves against his coat. He stared toward the north bend where the wash disappeared between red cliffs. The sun hit the rock faces, lighting them up like open wounds. A horse's whinny broke the stillness. Clara Bellamy came riding down the ridge, her silhouette sharp against the pale sky. The wind tangled a few loose strands of her hair, and even from a distance he could see how she sat her horse upright, steady, every motion measured like thought. She reined in beside him, the mare snorting, breath puffing in white clouds. "Well?" she asked. Elias kept his eyes on the dry bed. "He's taken the water." Her brow tightened. "Pike?" He nodded once. Clara looked past him toward the distant bend, where a thin line of smoke rose in the Sunday. "And the law?" "The law's on his payroll," he said flatly. "Judge Harlan owes him 3 mortgages and half his conscience." She swung down from her saddle, boots crunching on frost-hardened earth. Her coat flared slightly in the wind. "Then we'll find a higher law." Elias huffed out a sound that might have been a laugh if it weren't so tired. "Out here, ma'am, the highest law is whoever holds the shovel." Clara's eyes flashed. "Then we'll take the shovel." There it was again, that fire. Not reckless, but righteous. A kind of courage that burned without showmanship. He admired it even as unease coiled behind his ribs. Men had died on smaller principles than hers. They spent the rest of the afternoon tracing what was left of the old water line, riding along the dry wash where the banks rose in red clay walls. The sky turned the color of tarnished copper as the sun slid west. Hawks circled overhead, their shadows passing silently over the pale earth. Half a mile from the canyon bend, Elias dismounted and crouched by a line of deep ruts in the mud. He pressed 2 fingers into one of them. Still soft. "Wagon tracks," he said. "Heavy load." "Oh." Clara joined him, squinting. "Those are mule prints alongside." "Pike's men," Elias murmured. Then he froze. And that, between the larger tracks, was a smaller set of boots, uneven steps, one dragging slightly. He'd know that limp anywhere. "Billy," he said. "The boy's been following them," Clara said quietly. Elias's jaw hardened. "Then we'd better find him before Pike does." They mounted and rode hard into the narrowing canyon. The walls rose steep, painted in red and gold, the kind of beauty that made a man forget how cruel the place could be. Wind funneled through the gap, carrying the low moan of the land itself, a sound between warning and lament. As they rounded the bend, The sight before them stopped both horses cold. A crude dam, thick with pine logs and stone, spanned the wash from wall to wall. Behind it, water pooled dark and restless, trapped like an animal. The air smelled of wet wood and deceit. "God help us," Clara whispered. Pike's men had done their work well, quick and mean. No mercy in the craftsmanship, only greed. And standing near the dam, poking at its seams with a stick, was Billy Rios. 10 years old, hat too big for his head, muttering curses too old for his mouth. "Billy!" Clara's voice cracked through the canyon air. The boy jumped, almost fell into the water, then turned with a grin too wide for his small face. "Found where your water went, Mr. Crow." "Oh." Elias's heart hit once, hard enough to hurt. "You're lucky you didn't find where your grave would be. Get over here." Billy scrambled up the slope, cheeks red, eyes bright with the kind of pride only danger gives. "They're coming back," he panted. "Heard 'em say they're bringing dynamite tomorrow to make it higher." Clara looked at Elias, breath misting in the cold air. "We can't wait." "No," he said. "We can't." The sun dipped lower, turning the canyon walls to fire. They led the horses behind a boulder, out of sight, and set to work. Elias jammed a crowbar between 2 logs and heaved. The wood groaned, nails screeching against grain. Clara pulled at the loosened boards, her gloves tearing, hair whipping across her face. Water pushed against the dam with a sound like breath held too long. For a moment, Elias thought of Amos, how the old man had once told him that land remembers mercy longer than cruelty. He hoped that was true. When the final timber cracked, the sound was not a crash but a sigh, the long exhale of a wounded thing freed at last. A wall of muddy water burst through, roaring down the wash, carrying logs, stones, and the sins of men who'd built it. Billy whooped. Clara laughed once, wild and clear, before the sound vanished under the water's rush. Elias caught her arm as the ground trembled, steadying her. When it was over, the wash ran free again, silver under the dusk. The scent of wet earth rose like incense. Elias leaned on his crowbar, chest heaving. He could feel the pulse of the land under his boots alive again. "We'll have company come morning," he said. Clara wiped mud from her cheek. "I expect so." They stood for a while watching the water run. It gleamed under the dying sun like a promise they'd both chosen to believe in, even if it meant ruin. Then they rode home, the night closing around them, smoke from distant campfires painting the sky in thin gray ribbons. The ride home was long and silent, the kind of silence that lives between people who have seen something they can't unsee. The horses' hooves struck the frozen ground with dull thuds, and every so often Clara's breath turned to a pale mist in the dark. They didn't speak until the lights of Blue Mesa came into view, one lonely lantern in the window, a flicker of warmth waiting in a sea of black. Inside, the air smelled of ash and coffee gone bitter on the stove. Elias lit a lamp and set it on the table, the glass throwing golden circles on the walls. He hung his coat by the door, mud stiff along the hem, and leaned against the counter, every bone in his body aching with the kind of fatigue that comes from being right when you wish you were wrong. Clara spread Amos's old maps across the table. The parchment crackled like old fire. Her fingers traced the faded ink, following the lines that marked the wash and the creek, her lips moving soundlessly as if in prayer. "If we can prove the original survey of Blue Mesa included rights to the spring," she said, "we can take it to the county seat. The judge might be bought, but not the registrar in Prescott." Elias stared at the map, at the way her hand moved with calm certainty, and thought how strange it was that courage could look like handwriting. "It's near 80 miles, he said finally. "Rough ride through no man's land. No trail most of the way." "I've done rough before," she said. He smiled faintly, but there was no humor in it. "This isn't mud and fence posts, Clara. This is a different kind of rough. Men like Pike don't take kindly to being robbed of what they stole." She didn't look up. "I won't let that man take what Amos built or what you've kept alive." That last phrase landed somewhere deep inside him. He straightened slowly. "Clara," he said quietly, "I don't doubt your courage, but the road to Prescott's full of men who'd sell your scalp for a saddle." "Ugh." She looked at him then, the lamplight catching her eyes until they seemed to hold the fire itself. "Then you'd better come with me." He should have said no. He should have told her the law out here wasn't something you rode toward, it was something you buried. But her gaze didn't allow retreat. The kind of strength in her wasn't loud, it was the steady kind, the kind that made a man ashamed of how long he'd been standing still. He sighed and pulled out a chair. "All right," he said. "We ride at dawn." The lamp burned late that night. While she packed provisions, hard bread, dried meat, a tin of coffee, Elias found himself staring into the flames, seeing not fire but memory. War camps under red skies, men frozen in the mud, their eyes open, their faith gone. He'd thought he'd left that behind. But the world had a way of circling back, wearing a different face. Outside, the wind shifted. The old windmill groaned as it turned, as though reminding him of its loyalty. He envied its simplicity. Clara finished packing and sat down opposite him. "You're quiet." "Always am before a bad idea," he said. "You think this is one?" "I think this is the kind that gets carved on headstones." She smiled. "Then we'll make sure the carving's worth reading." The fire popped. Elias rubbed his temple, trying not to smile. "You always talk this way when you're scared?" "Only when I need to convince the man beside me not to lose his nerve." He looked up, meeting her eyes again. That might work. At dawn they packed light water, bread, Amos's ledger, a revolver Elias hadn't drawn in 3 years. Billy stood by the door, his face pale in the early light. "I can ride," he said. "You're staying," Elias told him. "I can shoot," the boy protested. "That's the problem." Elias crouched, putting a hand on the boy's shoulder. "You keep the house. If we don't come back, you tell Ruth. You hear?" Billy nodded, jaw tight, eyes glassy. Clara knelt, pressing a hand against his cheek. "We'll be back," she said. "You watch that stove and don't let the wind steal the fire." The boy blinked fast and turned away before they could see the tears. They rode out under a sky the color of iron. The land lay flat and endless, cold light spilling across the plains. In the distance, the buttes stood like old gods, silent, indifferent, watching. For the first few miles, neither spoke. The rhythm of hooves and the creak of leather said enough. When they finally reached the edge of the salt flats, Elias reined in and shaded his eyes. "You sure you want to see this through?" he asked. Clara's breath steamed in the air. "If you ask me again, I'll start thinking you're the one afraid." He chuckled low. "Fear's a good friend. Keeps you sharp. Then we'll be the sharpest pair in Arizona." They rode on. By noon, the wind had risen, scouring the flats with dry salt that glittered like snow but burned like glass. Every step of the horses threw up tiny storms that clung to their clothes. Elias's throat felt scraped raw. He kept glancing at the sun, measuring distance by pain. As the day wore on, they reached a cluster of rocks that gave a little shade. They dismounted, drank from their canteens, and sat in the meager shelter. Clara pulled out the folded map, spreading it on her knees. The paper trembled in the wind. "Once we cross the flats," she said, "there's a pass that cuts through toward Prescott. Amos marked it here." Elias leaned close, the scent of dust and sweat mixed with the faint trace of her soap, something lavender, something from a world that hadn't yet surrendered to grit. "That pass hasn't been used in years," he said. "You can tell by the way the ink's faded. Then maybe it's due for remembering." End of crate. He smiled, shook his head, and took a bite of dry bread. "You ever get tired of being right?" She looked at him sideways. "Not once." They rode again as the sun dropped low, its light turning the desert into a sheet of fire. The air shimmered. By the time they made camp under a leaning Joshua tree, Elias's back ached, and Clara's hands were raw from the rains. He built a small fire from twisted brush that burned with a blue flame, sharp-smelling and hot. She spread the blanket, her face flushed from wind and grit. The first stars appeared, cold and unfeeling. The night came down like a closing hand. No wind now, just stillness, a vast, listening quiet that made the fire crackle louder than it should have. The world around them was a sheet of shadow and blue flame. The Joshua tree leaned above them like an old sentinel, its twisted arms thrown up to the sky. Elias fed another branch into the fire. The wood hissed, sending a slow stream of sparks into the dark. They rose, flickered, and vanished into a sky crowded with cold stars. He watched them climb, remembering campfires from another life, men talking low, faces hollow with smoke and fear, the smell of gun, oil, and sweat. The same desert, different ghosts. Clara sat across from him, her knees drawn up, her gloved hands wrapped around a tin cup. She was studying the flames like they might give her an answer she'd been waiting years to hear. "You should sleep," Elias said. "So should you," she replied. "But you won't." He gave a short laugh. "You read me that well already? Better than you think." She looked over the fire at him. "You don't strike me as a man who sleeps much." "I did once," he said, "before I started keeping company with regrets." "That's the trouble with regrets," she murmured. "They're loyal, meant." He smiled at that faintly, ruefully. She wasn't wrong. The silence that followed was softer than before, like the desert itself had stopped to listen. After a long while she unfolded the map again. The parchment caught the light like old skin, thin and glowing. "If we make the ridge by noon tomorrow, we can cut 2 days off the trip. Amos marked a stream here," she pointed with a gloved finger. "It should still run this time of year." Elias leaned closer. The shadows danced across her cheekbones, her hair catching the light in strands of bronze. "That's a lot of faith to put in ink and memory." She smiled without looking up. "Out here, faith's just hope that survived the night." The wind shifted then, lifting sand that hissed through the fire. Clara held the map down with both hands, and Elias reached across instinctively to steady it. His fingers brushed hers rough against soft, old scars against new skin. She didn't pull away. For a moment, everything fire, desert, years paused. Then she said quietly, "You're cold." He shook his head. "Not from the weather." Her eyes lifted to his. "Then what?" He hesitated, looking past her to the darkness beyond the fire's reach. "Lately it feels like the land's testing me again, asking what I'm worth. I keep hoping I've already proved it." She tilted her head. "Maybe it's not the land asking." He looked back at her. "Then who?" "Yourself," she said simply. "You talk like a man waiting for permission to forgive himself." That hit harder than he expected. For a moment he couldn't find words. He poked at the fire instead, the embers flashing red like distant gunfire. "You sound like a preacher." "Maybe," she said, her voice low. "Or maybe I've just been listening." He wanted to answer, but what came out instead was closer to confession. "I keep seeing the war again. Every mile we ride, it's there, same dust, same lies, same men thinking they own what can't be owned. Only difference now is I've got someone beside me who still believes the world can be fixed." She held his gaze. The flamelight made her eyes seem deeper than night. "Then believe it with me." He nodded slowly, feeling something shift in his chest, like a door he'd kept locked had just given way. "I'll try," he said. And though he didn't mean to, his voice came out as prayer. The wind rose again, scattering sparks upward. They sat closer, not touching, the silence alive with breath and the quiet hum of the desert. Coyotes cried somewhere far off, their voices thin and lonely. The stars wheeled slow and patient above them, and the fire sank low. "Tell me something true, Elias," she said after a while. He looked at her, surprised. "I thought I already did. Tell me something you haven't said out loud in years." He stared into the fire for a long time before answering. "I miss music," he said. "Real music, fiddle strings, a piano out of tune, a crowd that knows the words. I didn't think I'd live long enough to miss something that ordinary." She smiled. "Maybe when this is over, we'll find a place with a piano. Places like that don't exist anymore." "Then we'll build one," she said, as if the idea were simple. "You fix fences, I'll find the keys." He laughed then quietly, but real. "You don't give up easy. I didn't come this far to start." The fire dwindled to coals, the heat settling deep in the sand. Clara leaned back against her saddle, staring up at the stars. Elias sat beside her, hat tipped low, but his eyes stayed open. He wasn't watching the sky. He was watching the way her breathing slowed, the rise and fall of her chest, the small peace that had finally found her face. He thought, "If the land ever takes me, I hope it's under this same sky." By dawn, the sandstorm had passed. The desert lay new again, washed clean by wind. They woke stiff and cold, their blankets crusted with frost. Elias kicked dirt over the ashes and saddled the horses, while Clara folded the map, her fingers steady now. The air smelled of sage and salt. In the distance, the ridge glowed faintly gold. When they crested it, the valley below shimmered with light. The freed water, what they'd risked so much to release, had already carved new paths through the sand. Tiny shoots of green clung to the banks. It wasn't much, but it was life. Clara smiled through cracked lips. "You see that, Mr. Crow? It's still running." He nodded. "So are we." They rode for 2 more days, chasing the horizon that never stopped moving. The trail turned from dust to shale to hard-baked clay, each mile wearing the horses thinner. The silence between them wasn't cold now, it was companionship worn smooth by miles. The land changed as they climbed out of the wash country into higher ground. The mesas dropped away behind them, and the world stretched wide, pale gold under a sky bleached near white. Every so often, they passed the husk of an old homestead, a single chimney, a fence that led nowhere, a story long since buried in sand. Elias always looked. He couldn't help himself. Each ruin felt like a warning. Clara noticed. "You keep staring at ghosts," she said one morning, her tone somewhere between fond and weary. He grunted. Ghosts keep staring back.
I can't believe
The
it.
horses plodded onward, hooves thudding dully. The sun burned slow and steady, its light turning everything into silhouettes and shadows. By noon, heat ripples bent the horizon. Elias loosened his bandana, feeling the grit on his teeth. "You ever think," Clara said after a while, "that maybe this whole country was built on the wrong kind of courage?" He glanced at her. "What kind's that? The kind that takes instead of keeps." He let that hang a while before answering. "Out here, takin' and keepin' are the same thing to most folks. Only difference is what you tell yourself when you lay down at night." She looked straight ahead. "Then maybe it's time we changed what people tell themselves." He smiled without turning. "You always talk like you're fixin' the world." "Someone has to," she said. The wind carried her words away across the flats, but they stuck in him anyway. That afternoon, they found the creek again. It had thinned out to a silver thread, but it was still moving, cutting quietly through the desert. They stopped to water the horses. Elias crouched, scooped a handful, and drank. The taste was sharp, cold, alive. He looked at Clara kneeling beside him, her reflection trembling in the water. "You did this," he said softly. "We did it," she corrected. He shook his head. "I would have waited. You didn't." She smiled. "Then maybe that's why we're both still standing." They lingered there a while, letting the sound of running water wash the dust from their thoughts. Above them, hawks rode the thermals, lazy and precise. When they finally mounted again, the light had changed. The sun hung low, bleeding orange into the canyons. Shadows lengthened, stretching thin over the ground. They were still 30 miles from Prescott County when the wind shifted and brought with it a smell Elias hadn't expected: smoke. He reined in, scanning the horizon. "Campfire." Clara shaded her eyes. "You think it's Pike's men?" "Could be," he said. "Or drifters. Either way, we ride quiet." They moved on, slow and silent. The smell thickened. Near dusk, they spotted the fire. A small orange pulse at the base of a rocky outcrop. 2 figures sat by it, their silhouettes jerky and careless, the kind of men who didn't think danger traveled at night. Elias motioned for Clara to stay back. He dismounted and crept closer through the brush. The wind covered his steps. He heard laughter, sharp, mean. "Damn fool woman and that crowbait rancher," one voice said. "Pike'll pay double when he hears what we saw." Elias froze. Blood roared in his ears. He stepped out before he'd thought it through. "Maybe you can tell me yourself," he said. The men jumped. One went for his belt. Elias didn't give him the chance. The revolver was in his hand without memory, like shaking hands with an old habit. He fired once into the dirt near the man's boot. The shot cracked through the night, echoing against stone. "Next one won't be polite," Elias said. The man's partner raised his hands. "We were just talking, mister." "I heard," Elias said. "Now you're going to do something better. You're going to walk that way." He pointed toward the darkness. "Leave your rifles. Leave your horses." They hesitated until Clara rode into view. her silhouette sharp against the firelight, rifle steady in her hands. "Do as he says," she said, voice calm but hard. The men obeyed. When they were gone, she lowered the rifle and exhaled. "You said the law was on his side," she said. "Guess that makes us the outlaws." Elias holstered his gun. "Sometimes law's just what a man won't do. Tonight, I didn't let him finish, a bad sentence." They camped where the men had been, the fire still warm. Elias didn't sleep. He sat staring into the flames until dawn, listening to the sound of Clara breathing. They reached Prescott County late the next evening. The world changed slowly, more fences, more signs of hands shaping the wild. The air smelled faintly of smoke and iron. On the horizon, a cluster of roofs caught the last light of day. Clara straightened in her saddle. "Is that it?" "That's it," Elias said. "County line's near that ridge." They rode in silence. The closer they came, the heavier the air felt. Every hoofbeat seemed to echo with something more than sound, like a tolling bell. When they reached the rise, the sign stood there half buried in dust, the paint fading but the words still legible. "Law serves all men. Territory of Arizona." Elias stopped, reading it twice. The corners of his mouth tightened. "Let's hope that's true this time." Clara looked at him. "And if it isn't?" He glanced toward the horizon, where the sun burned down behind the mountains. "Then we remind it what truth looks like." The wind picked up, pulling at their coats. Behind them, the land stretched away in golden shadow. Ahead, Prescott waited another trial, another reckoning. They rode forward, slow but sure, into the long red light of evening. The courthouse in Prescott wasn't much to look at, just 4 walls of sandstone bleached to bone and a bell that never rang on time. Yet that morning, when Elias Crow and Clara Bellamy rode up Main Street, the whole town seemed to hold its breath. Prescott wasn't built for spectacle. Its streets were narrow, its boardwalks warped from years of sun and rain, but news traveled faster than freight, and by dawn everyone knew there'd be a hearing. Blue Mesa against Jonah Pike. Right against Rich. A fight people had been waiting for but never dared to name. Dust hung in the air, thick as guilt. The bell tolled once late, off-key, and the sound shivered through the buildings, like something remembering its purpose. Pike's buckboard was already outside, wheels caked with clay from Dry Angel Wash, the same red hue as the stolen dam. His men lounged by the hitch rail, guns low on their hips, hats pulled down in that studied slouch of confidence men wear when they need the world to forget their fear. One spat into the street, another laughed at nothing. Elias swung down from his horse and handed the reins to a stable boy. The lad's eyes flicked from the revolver at Elias's belt to the scar along his jaw. "You fixin' to win, mister?" he whispered. Elias looked toward the courthouse doors. "Just fixin' to tell the truth, Ode." Inside, the air was cooler but not kinder. The floorboards smelled of varnish and old tobacco. Sunlight pushed through tall windows, catching dust motes that drifted like slow snow. At the front sat Judge Wexler, red-nosed, shoulders slumped, a man half remembering his duty. Beside him leaned Jonah Pike, all waistcoat and watch chain, his grin a monument to certainty. Elias and Clara stood before them, dust still on their coats. She held Amos's ledger to her chest. He held his hat like it might pray for him. "Case of Blue Mesa Ranch versus Pike Holdings," the clerk read, voice flat but trembling at the edges. "Claim of unlawful obstruction and water theft under the Homestead Water Act." The judge squinted down. "Mrs. Bellamy," he began, voice thick with condescension, "you're a long way from Pennsylvania. You mean to tell this court you know more about water rights than Mr. Pike here, who's been running land in this county 20 years? Clara's reply was calm, clear, every word hammered true. "No, Your Honor, I mean to tell the truth. The Blue Mesa deed signed by Sheriff Amos Lyle in '73 and sealed by this very court grants access to Dry Angel Wash in perpetuity for agricultural use." She opened the ledger. The pages whispered as they turned. "Here are records of every season since cattle counts, rainfall, feed sales, every drop accounted for. Less." A stir ran through the benches, men shifting, women leaning forward. The judge frowned. "And how do you know this is authentic?" Elias stepped forward and placed a small brass tool on the table. The room tilted toward it. It was nothing special to look at, just a pipe with notches cut along its length, but the light caught the letters carved near its end. A.L. "Because, Your Honor," Elias said quietly. "This was Amos's. He made it himself to measure the spring flow. It's got his hand carved right here." He turned the metal so the morning sun flashed along its worn edge. A murmur moved through the gallery. Someone in the back whispered Amos's name like a benediction. The judge leaned forward, squinting. "And this proves what, exactly?" "That the wash ran steady until Pike built his dam," Elias said. "We broke it open 2 days ago. Water runs again. Ask anyone downriver, they're watering stock off it this morning." Voices rose low, uncertain, but real. Men who'd worked the valley nodded. A ranch wife wiped her eyes. Truth, fragile but alive, had entered the room. Pike's lawyer, a thin man with fox teeth and a vest too fine for his soul, shot to his feet. "Objection. My client's reservoir is lawful under territorial charter. Blue Mesa holds no current registration. Its last filing expired 3 years back." Clara didn't blink. It would have been renewed if the sheriff who held the papers hadn't died protecting this town from the men Mr. Pike paid to drive off our cattle. The words landed like a bullet. The room froze. Somewhere a chair creaked. Judge Wexler cleared his throat. "That's a bold accusation." Elias stepped forward, his shadow falling across the floorboards. "It's the truth," he said. "I saw the bullets that killed him, same caliber as the rifles Pike's men use. I dug them out of the barn wall with these hands." He lifted them, rough, scarred, trembling slightly, not with fear but memory. The room held its breath. Even Pike stopped smiling. The clock ticked once, twice, each click loud as judgment. Finally the judge turned toward Pike. "You care to answer that, Mr. Pike?" The rancher smirked, wiping his mouth with a silk handkerchief. "All I care about, Your Honor, is order. Progress. The railroad's coming through, and you can't build progress without water. These people," he waved a lazy hand at Elias and Clara, "want to stop growth. Hold us all back in mud and dust. Lay. Progress that steals," Clara said, "is still theft." It wasn't loud, but it cut the room clean in two. A few heads nodded. A few hands clenched. Then Reverend Cole rose from the back, Bible in hand, his voice rolling deep as thunder. "Judge, this town was built on the word of men like Amos Lyle and Elias Crow. If that word don't stand, then neither does the law on that wall behind you." The judge's eyes lifted to the carved plank above his bench. In law, justice; in justice, mercy. For the first time that morning, he looked ashamed. He rubbed his temples. "This court will recess for 15 minutes. The gavel came down, sharp as a gunshot. The room exhaled all at once, boots scraping, whispers breaking loose like floodwater. Clara turned to Elias. "Did we reach him?" Elias's jaw tightened. "We reached the people. Sometimes that's enough." They stepped out into the courtyard, the air cool and heavy with the smell of iron rain. Prescott was a small town, but in that moment it felt like the center of something vast and trembling. Farmers, wives, and drifters alike gathered near the steps, whispering in low bursts of worry and hope. The courthouse bell struck once late again, but this time its tone carried across the rooftops with strange purpose, as though the metal itself had remembered what truth sounded like. Clara breathed deeply, setting the ledger against her hip. "If the law's half as honest as that sound," she murmured, "we might have a chance." Elias glanced toward the end of the street, where Pike's men smoked in a tight knot by the hitch rail, watching. "Chance is all we ever get," he said. Pike emerged then, flanked by his lawyer. His boots clicked slow on the courthouse boards, the sound too sharp for the air around it. He paused as he passed them, leaning close enough for Elias to catch the sour scent of tobacco and arrogance. "You won't keep it," Pike said softly. "I'll burn that ranch to the ground before I see it run by a woman." The words didn't come loud, but they crawled under the skin. Clara stiffened, fingers tightening on the ledger. Elias's hand drifted toward his belt habit, not thought, but he stopped himself. "Not here, not in front of the town." He met Pike's gaze. "You had your chance to build something decent," he said quietly. "You chose rot. Don't expect it to save you when it falls." Pike's smile barely twitched. You think you can stop the tide, Crow? Men like me are the tide. Then you'd better learn to swim, Elias said. The rancher's face darkened, but before he could reply, thunder rolled over the mountains. A first fat drop of rain struck the dust between them, darkening it like ink. Pike scowled and turned away, pulling his coat tighter. His men followed, spurs clinking. Within minutes they were swallowed by the street's haze. Elias stood still, watching until the sound of hooves faded. Only then did he let the breath go. Clara was looking at him, half fear, half fire. You were going to draw, she said. He nodded once. Thought about it. Then what stopped you? He looked up at the darkening sky. He's not worth another ghost. They stood together under the overhang while rain began to whisper against the wood. The street went quiet except for the patter of drops and the distant clatter of shutters being pulled shut. Clara turned toward him. When you spoke in there, she said, I saw the whole room shift. Not just the judge, the people. They remember Amos now. He gave a weary smile. Amos never needed remembering, just someone to keep his promises breathing. You think that's what we're doing? I think that's all anyone can do, he said. She nodded, eyes on the rain pooling in the ruts of the street. It's strange, she said softly. We fought for water, and now the sky's giving it back. Maybe it was listening. The bell rang again from inside, signaling the end of recess. The sound mingled with the rainfall until it was impossible to tell which came first, justice or storm. Elias straightened. Time to finish what we started. They walked back through the courthouse doors, boots wet, shoulders squared. The people followed quiet now, reverent in their waiting. Inside, Judge Wexler sat hunched forward, his gavel resting in his hand like a decision half made. He looked older than before, smaller somehow, as if 15 minutes of silence had shown him the measure of his own cowardice. Pike and his lawyer were already seated. The air around them smelled of nervous cologne and smoke. Elias and Clara took their place again before the bench. The clerk's pen scratched faintly at his pad, marking the return of order. When the judge spoke, his voice cracked on the first word. This court has reviewed the deed and the testimony. He stopped, rubbed his brow, and for a moment looked not like a man of law but like a man cornered by his own conscience. Before I pass judgment, Mr. Pike, I want to ask you one thing. Did you or did you not commission construction on Dry Angel Wash without formal survey approval? Pike's lawyer rose, ready to object, but the judge snapped, Sit down. Pike's lips parted in a grin that didn't reach his eyes. We built a reservoir, Your Honor. Lawful improvement under section. Answer the question, Wexler said. For the first time, the room leaned forward. Rain rattled softly on the windows. Pike hesitated, the grin faltering. We may have started preliminary work, he said, but that's common practice in development. Wexler nodded slowly, as though each syllable confirmed something he already knew. Common practice, he repeated, for men who think themselves untouchable. Clara's fingers tightened on the ledger. Elias could hear the rain increasing, steady and sure. Pike shifted in his seat. Your Honor, this is ridiculous. You'd throw away progress for a dead man's ranch and a woman's sentiment. The judge's gavel struck once. I'd throw away you for less. Gasps rippled through the gallery. Pike's lawyer stammered, Your Honor, but Wexler wasn't listening. He looked out at the people instead, at the weathered faces turned toward him with something that looked almost like faith. When I took this chair, he said, I swore to serve the law. Somewhere along the way, I started serving the men who paid me to look the other way. Maybe today's the day I start fixing that. A low murmur rose, hope unsteady but breathing. The judge cleared his throat. This court will render its ruling. He paused, eyes flicking once toward the window where the rain ran in slow streaks down the glass. And God help me, he muttered. It'll be the right one. Judge Wexler's hand trembled slightly as he lifted the papers before him. The sound of rain against the courthouse roof grew louder, steady, unrelenting, like the world itself leaning in to listen. This court recognizes, he began, voice gaining strength with each word, the original deed of Blue Mesa as valid and binding under the authority of the Arizona territorial law. He stopped, let the silence stretch, then looked directly at Jonah Pike. Any obstruction on Dry Angel Wash erected by you or your agents is hereby ordered dismantled. immediate compliance. The water belongs to the land and to those who keep it alive. For a heartbeat, no one breathed. The words seemed to hover in the air, unreal, fragile as glass. Then someone at the back of the room started clapping, hesitant, almost apologetic. Another joined, then another. Within seconds, the courthouse erupted cheers, boots stomping on the floorboards, the sound swelling like a river breaking loose. Clara stood motionless at first, the ledger still clutched to her chest. Then her breath left her in a rush. Her shoulders shook once, not with tears, but with release. Elias turned toward her. She met his eyes. And for that single heartbeat, the years of fight, loss, and dust fell away. He nodded once, slow and reverent, as if acknowledging something far older than justice, something like faith. Pike's lawyer shot to his feet, voice cutting through the din. "Your Honor, this is irregular." Wexler's gavel slammed down. "Justice often is," he said. "Case closed." "Oh." Pike's face had gone a strange color, half rage, half disbelief. He lurched forward, his voice cracking. "You'll regret this, Judge. The railroad will follow the law," Wexler said sharply. "Or it won't run through my county." The gavel fell again, final this time. And just as it did, thunder rolled across the hills. A flash of white light split the windows. Then came the rain, real rain, not the stingy drizzle of the high desert, but a downpour, hard and generous, slapping against the panes as though applauding the verdict. For a long moment, no one moved. People just stood, stunned, listening to the sound. Then laughter broke out. Pure, wild laughter. Hats flew up, boots stamped, hands clapped strangers' shoulders. Men who hadn't spoken in months were hugging, shouting above the storm. Outside, the street turned to silver. Water streamed off the roofs, running in quick rivers through the ruts. Clara pushed open the courthouse doors and stepped into it. The ledger pressed against her chest, the rain running down her hair, her coat, her hands. She tilted her face upward and laughed, a bright, unguarded sound that carried down the street like a hymn. Elias followed her out, slower, his limp more noticeable on the slick boards. He raised his face, too. The rain hit hard and cold, but it felt like forgiveness. He hadn't realized how long it had been since he'd let it touch him without flinching. "It's raining," Clara said, voice thick with disbelief. Elias smiled faintly. Maybe it was waiting for the right verdict. Around them, townsfolk were pouring into the street, women holding up skirts, children dancing barefoot, men tossing their hats skyward. The smell of wet dust rose like incense. Reverend Cole stepped out beside them, the Bible still in his hand, pages fluttering. "Seems the Lord's testimony got entered after all," he said, grinning through the downpour. Clara laughed again. Elias only nodded. His eyes, beneath the brim of his soaked hat, were soft but distant, watching the rain turn the dirt to life. They stayed until the street ran mud around their boots, until thunder echoed like applause from the mountains. The courthouse bell rang one last time, the sound pure for once, not late, not crooked, just true. By the time they reached the livery, the storm had gentled into mist. Their horses stood steaming, flanks glistening. Elias wiped rain from the saddle horn with his sleeve. His hands trembled not from cold, but from something loosening deep inside him. Clara came up beside him. "You're shaking," she said. "Not from fear," he said. "Feels more like I'm thawing." She smiled, and for a moment her face was all light, framed by the dripping brim of her hat. "You ever think maybe the West isn't finished testing us?" Elias chuckled softly. "Then it better keep trying. We're still standing." They rode out through the soaked street, past the swinging sign of the courthouse, past Pike's buckboard already mired in mud. His men stood by it, silent now, eyes lowered. The arrogance had drained out of them with the dust. One of them, younger than the rest, met Elias's gaze as they passed and tipped his hat, not in surrender, but in acknowledgement. The gesture meant more than words. As they left Prescott behind, the sound of rain on their hats and coats was steady, comforting. The air smelled clean, the way it does after the first truth in a long drought. When the road leveled out, Clara spoke. "He'll come for us, you know, Pike. Men like him don't lose easy." "I know," Elias said, "but the land's on our side now. and that's a hard ally to beat. The ride back to Blue Mesa was long and half forgotten by the world. The downpour followed them for miles, washing the dust from every rock and blade of grass. By the time the ridge came into view, the clouds had broken open into streaks of rose and gold, the evening light turning the soaked land into a mirror. They rode in silence. There was nothing left to say. The air itself seemed to hum with something new, a peace, born not from comfort, but from survival. When they crested the final rise, the ranch spread before them like a promise kept. The windmill spun free again, its blades cutting through the wind with a clean metallic rhythm. The troughs shimmered, full to the brim. The cattle were scattered across the field, tails flicking, heads down in the wet grass. The sound of life returned low, steady, and certain. Clara stopped her horse and looked down at it all. For a long time she didn't move. Then she said, softly, "It's beautiful." Alias dismounted, boots sinking into the soft mud. "It's honest," he said. They led the horses toward the barn, the air cool and sweet with rain. Inside, the lantern light glowed faintly against the wet walls. The smell of hay and oil mingled with the faint scent of wildflowers brought in by the storm. Elias hung up the tack while Clara lit the lamp on the workbench. "You ever think," she said, turning slowly, "that maybe the land only listens when we finally stop shouting at it?" He smiled, unbuttoning his coat. "Then it must have had a long wait." "Mun," she laughed quietly. The sound was small, but it filled the space between them in a way the wind never could. Later, inside the cabin, the fire snapped and hissed as if pleased to have company again. Elias sat at the table, the ledger open before him, the pages damp at the edges from her hands. Clara stood by the stove, stirring a pot of stew, her hair loose for once, catching the light like warm copper. "You kept your word," she said, glancing at him over her shoulder. He shook his head slowly. "We kept it." She studied him, and for the first time, the hard lines in her face softened. "You know," she said, "when I first came west, I thought justice was a thing you found, something already built. But it's not, is it? It's something you have to make over and over, every time someone forgets." Elias traced a finger down one of Amos's old entries. Amos used to say the same thing. Said justice was like a fence, you don't just build it and walk away. You mend it when it breaks. You fix it when the wind knocks it down. "And today we fixed it," she said quietly. "For now," he replied. "The wind always comes again." She smiled. "Then I guess we'll just keep fixing it." He looked up at her, the lamplight painting her features gold and soft. "You make it sound easy." "Not easy," she said. "Just worth it." They ate in silence for a while, listening to the soft rain patter on the roof. Every sound felt sharper, truer, the clink of the spoons, the creak of the chairs, the low rumble of thunder still wandering somewhere far beyond the hills. It wasn't peace exactly, but something close enough to rest inside. When they finished, Clara stood and cleared the dishes, then lingered by the window. "It's still raining," she said. Elias came to stand beside her. Outside, the land glistened in the lamplight, every puddle catching pieces of the stars that had begun to appear. The night smelled clean, raw, forgiven. "You think it'll last?" she asked. He thought for a moment. "Nothing ever does. But that's what makes it matter." She turned to him then, really turned, and the space between them was suddenly small. For a heartbeat, neither spoke. The rain filled the silence. Then she smiled faintly. "You still owe me supper, Mr. Crow." He laughed, low and quiet. "Then we'd better make it a good one." Outside, the world was new again. The rain thinned into mist, rising off the ground like breath. The windmill spun, its blades singing softly. The troughs overflowed, water running down the slope toward the creek that had started it all. In the distance, lightning flickered once more over the mountains, not as threat but as promise. The thunder that followed rolled deep and far, not angry now, just old like the land stretching after a long sleep. Inside the cabin, the fire burned low. Elias leaned back in his chair, his bad legs stretched out, the ache of it softer now. He watched the flames and thought of Amos, of all the winters that had come and gone, of the wars both fought and endured. He thought of Clara, and how the West had a strange way of giving back what it had stolen, never whole. but enough to keep a soul from turning to stone. He closed the ledger gently, the sound of the pages like a prayer ending. "Amos," he said softly, as if the old man might still be listening, "we did right by you." From the stove came the quiet rattle of dishes being set aside, and then Clara's voice, barely above a whisper. "You did right by more than him." He didn't answer. He didn't need to. The rain had begun again, soft, steady, eternal. If you're watching on TV, don't hesitate, grab your phone and hit subscribe to my channel so you'll never miss out on our amazing characters. That night, the land of Last West Town slept easier. The law had found its backbone again, and two weary souls had found, if not peace, something gentler, something like grace. The wind moved across the plains, carrying the scent of wet earth and pine. And somewhere, beneath the endless sky, the sound of water kept running, proof that even in the hardest country on earth, justice could still find a way home. Spring came like a man forgiven. It didn't rush or boast its arrival. It drifted into the valley, hesitant and slow, as if the land itself had forgotten how to soften. The air no longer cut, but sighed. The days stretched in small mercies, an hour more light, a little less wind, the faint smell of wet grass after months of frost and wood smoke. Grass came first, those first fragile blades stabbing through earth scarred by winter hooves. They grew in silence, stubborn and bright against the dark soil. Then came the water, the song of dry angel wash, no longer a ghost of itself but a living current again. It murmured through the gullies and into the troughs, carrying the sound of promise. Every dawn, that running water greeted the ranch before the sun did. Elias Crow leaned against the porch post of the Blue Mesa house and watched it all unfold. The world was mending itself, and for once he didn't feel the need to hurry it along. His legs still ached when the weather turned, and the scar across his shoulder hummed when he lifted too much weight, but he had stopped measuring his days by pain. What mattered were the hours when it didn't own him. He rubbed his thumb against the smooth edge of his coffee cup, feeling the faint warmth seeping into his hands. The horizon was still washed in silver, the morning clouds breaking open slow as breath. He watched a hawk drift lazy circles above the ridge, its wings catching the first light. Behind him, the door creaked open. Clara Bellamy stepped out, carrying 2 cups of coffee. Her hair, freed from the pins she used to favor, caught the morning breeze. A few strands escaped, gold against her cheek. She no longer wore the black dress she'd carried west from Pennsylvania she'd left mourning behind a month ago, the color fading from her closet like an old bruise. "Morning," she said, her voice soft but certain. Elias nodded. "The kind worth getting up for." They stood side by side, sharing the quiet. The porch boards creaked under their boots. The house exhaled the scent of old pine and lamp oil. The world had slowed enough to let them listen. A pair of hawks wheeled higher, calling to each other in long, thin cries that echoed across the canyon, the sound of old souls, making sure they weren't alone. Down below, the apple trees Amos had planted years before had finally bloomed again. White blossoms, delicate as breath, hung from the branches. It had taken years of pruning, waiting, and one miracle of water for them to remember how. "It's strange," Clara murmured. "After all the noise, how quiet it is." "Ja." Elias took a sip of coffee. "Quiet's the sound of things working like they should." She smiled faintly. "You really think we've earned it?" He looked toward the hills, where sunlight caught on the wet grass. "Maybe not earned," he said, "but stayed long enough to deserve it." The wind carried their words away. Somewhere in the distance, a cow lowed lazily. The sound of the windmill turning came faint but steady, a heartbeat against the silence. They finished their coffee and started down toward the pasture. The grass was soft underfoot, thick from the rains. The cattle grazed slow and content, their reflections rippling in the wash, the same water that had once been stolen and reclaimed. Clara bent and picked up a smooth river stone, turning it over in her palm. "Do you ever think about leaving?" she asked. Elias considered. "Used to," he said. "Back when leaving was the only way I knew how to survive. Now I think about staying until I can't." She looked at him sideways. "And me?" He smiled, not the crooked smirk of habit, but something gentler. His eyes, always gray before, seemed to hold a trace of blue now, like the wash in sunlight. "You're the reason there's something here to stay for." She didn't speak. She didn't need to. She just stepped closer, and the silence between them did the talking. That afternoon, the sun climbed high, spilling gold across the valley. The scent of wild sage rose from the hillsides, mingling with the smoke from the kitchen stove. Blue Mesa looked alive again, fences mended, troughs full, the barn roof catching light instead of decay. It wasn't perfect. It was real. Elias spent part of the morning at the forge, hammering out a new hinge for the corral gate. The clang of metal echoed across the yard, rhythmic and sure. Clara worked in the garden, sleeves rolled to her elbows, hair tied back with a strip of faded ribbon. Every so often, she'd glance toward the house, as if to make sure it was still standing, still theirs. When the work was done, they sat on the porch steps eating bread still warm from the oven. Clara brushed flour from her hands, the smell of yeast and sunlight between them. "You ever think Amos would have believed all this?" she asked. Elias looked out over the land, now green and breathing. "He believed in it before we did. He just never got to see it healed." She nodded slowly. "Then I'm glad we stayed long enough to show him." The afternoon light stretched thin across the fields. Elias could hear the steady rush of dry angel wash, endless and forgiving. Somewhere out there, buried beneath time and dust, was the broken dam's splintered wood, rusted nails, the grave of greed. The water had buried it in silence, erasing the shape of wrong. That was the land's way of forgiving. At noon, the sound of hooves came up the ridge, followed by laughter and the rattle of pots. Ruth Abernathy rode ahead, her bonnet tied askew, a basket balanced in one arm. Behind her came Billy on a pony that looked too small for his growing frame. Both of them were grinning as if they'd just discovered spring themselves. "Reverend says they're naming the new rail stop after the creek," Ruth called out before she even dismounted. "Angel Wash Station. He reckons it'll bring business." Then, Clara shaded her eyes, smiling. "Well, it earned the name honest enough." Ruth swung down, dust puffing up around her boots. "Town's buzzing, you two. Folks talking about building a telegraph line, maybe even a schoolhouse before next winter. Guess justice does more than fill a trough, it stirs up dreams." Billy hopped off his pony and marched up to Elias like a soldier reporting in. "Mr. Crow, Reverend Cole says he wants you to speak at Sunday service." Elias raised a brow. "Me? Why in hell would he want that?" "'Cause you're the only man who's ever made a judge sweat and God smile at the same time," Billy said proudly. The boy's words made Ruth laugh so hard she had to wipe her eyes. "Language, Billy," she said between giggles. Elias shook his head, chuckling low. "You tell the Reverend I already did my preaching in the courthouse." Billy shrugged, eyes bright. "He said you'd say that. Told me to tell you folks listen better when the preacher don't sound like a preacher." Clara leaned forward, teasing. "He's right, you know. You've got a way of saying things people remember." Elias grunted. "Most of what I say's just common sense. That's why they'll remember it," she said softly. They ate together under the porch bread, roasted potatoes, and Ruth's apple pie so sweet it made Elias blink twice. Rainwater dripped from the eaves, the smell of damp earth heavy in the air. The four of them talked like family about crops, cattle, rumors of the railroad. Billy told them how the smithy's apprentice had proposed to the baker's daughter, then turned red as a chili pepper when Clara teased, "You taking notes?" As they talked, the valley hummed around them. Bees moved through the new blossoms, cattle lowed contentedly, and somewhere down by the wash, a frog croaked its first song of the season. Ruth stretched her legs, sighing. "It feels different here," she said, "like the land's been holding its breath all these years and finally let it go." Elias nodded. "It has. Water'll do that to a place, and to people." Ruth looked at Clara with a knowing smile. "And to hearts." Clara's cheeks colored. "It's the coffee, not the water," she said lightly. But Ruth's grin didn't fade. Billy leaned back against the post, chewing on a blade of grass. "Reckon trouble's gone for good?" he asked. Elias glanced at the horizon. "Trouble's like wind, it doesn't disappear, it just changes direction." The boy mulled that over, nodding as if it were scripture. "Then I'll keep my hat on." Everyone laughed again. The sound was rich, unguarded, the kind that reached the edges of the valley and came back softer. When the sun began to dip, Ruth and Billy loaded their baskets and climbed